Welcome to City Works, a production of the City University of New York School of Labor and Urban Studies and CUNY TV. I'm Laura Flanders. Every month, City Works explores the lives of working people on the job, at home, and in our communities in order to see how best to advance an agenda of social justice and economic equity. On today's program, Children at Work, the alarming rise in recent years in the number of children illegally employed by companies in cities and on farms here in the U.S. The Labor Department says it's seen a 69% increase since 2018. In the last fiscal year, 835 companies were found to employ more than 3,800 children in violation of federal labor laws. Laws in the U.S. prohibit certain very dangerous work for anyone under the age of 18, but recent investigative reporting by the New York Times and Reuters found migrant children as young as 12 working at car factories, meat processors, and construction sites. Child labor violations by more typical employers of teens, fast food chains, for example, have also been documented, with minors of varied demographics working schedules far longer and later than what's legally allowed. What is going on here, and why is this happening now? Just recently, the Biden administration announced new steps to crack down on child labor violations, including tougher investigations of the companies involved. Will that work? Joining us today to help us make sense of this national crisis is Steve Fraser, a writer and labor historian. His latest book is Mongrel Firebugs and Men of Property: Capitalism and Class Conflict in American History. We're also joined by Nina Mast, an economic analyst at the Economic Policy Institute in Washington, D.C., and the co-author of a recent Institute report on child labor protections. We welcome you both to City Works. Glad to have you. Steve, let's just start with you. Are you shocked by what we're seeing today?
Yes and no. Yes, because most of us assumed child labor was abolished decades ago. So it's stunning and shocking, appalling to see it return, but not so much because our society has been in kind of economic decline, at least with respect to the welfare of working people, for many years now, decades actually. And so my shock is tempered by a sense of we are a developed country undergoing underdevelopment, austerity, the end of or not the end, but the withering away of the social safety net, a rotting infrastructure, life expectancy falling for many parts of the population. So I think the return of child labor is in some sense a piece of that picture.
Nina, when you started researching this for EPI, what was the most shocking thing that you found?
I think what was most surprising to me was really the coordination going on behind a lot of these attempts to roll back child labor protections in many states. I think, like Steve said, I wasn't necessarily surprised to see illegal child labor make such a huge comeback, but I think the coordination of these industry groups and sort of right-wing think tanks was more surprising to me, and that it echoed a lot of the other types of assaults we're seeing on children and families, whether that's the erosion of the social safety net, attempts to abolish public education, or just deregulate employment generally. So I think seeing that coordination was really, really opened my eyes to the depth of this problem.
There's two things we're talking about here. One is child labor that is currently illegal. And the second is what you're talking about, Nina, which is a concerted effort to do away with some of those prohibitions. Which piece of that do you want to start with, Steve?
Well, I mean, what's catching the eye of the public finally is that in a whole bunch of states, Nina will know more precisely, but I think at least a dozen or more states, there are efforts underway, some successful, some still pending, to eliminate or dismantle child labor protections, whether in terms of the kind of work children can do, the age at which they can do it, the length of time they can spend doing it. All of these things are afoot in a bunch of states, and I should note that these are not just red states, they are blue states as well.
You mentioned Iowa in your report.
Yes, Iowa is one such place.
12-year-olds can work there?
Yeah, yes, that's what they are. In fact, the legislature approved that law, so now they can do that, employ people, kids at that age, yes.
And doing what?
Well, it's amazing. There are apparently kids doing work like roofing, excavation work, demolition, dangerous kinds of work, heavy manual labor, you name it. The child labor now is present in virtually every sector of the economy. It's hard to name one, maybe high tech, no, that you wouldn't find some amount of child labor, fast food places, industrial laundries, you name it.
And we're not talking kids delivering newspapers
No.
or working in their parents' shops every so often.
No. Well, they're probably still delivering newspapers someplace, but they're mainly working in industrial settings or agricultural settings, doing hard labor, and often these children are the children of people who have come here from other countries, some of whom are here alone, and their families abroad are depending on some of the income they can make to support their families elsewhere in the global south. And this is, in a certain sense, reminiscent of what used to happen in 19th century America, where working class families were so poor that they actually needed the income of their kids to survive because they were paid so badly.
We're going to see a report later that speaks to some of that. Some of these kids want to work, but they're not the ones lobbying to change the laws. Nina, what did you find when you looked at what was happening in certain states, not on the legislative level yet, but at the level of who's working, doing what?
Sure. So, we are particularly concerned about the role of migrant labor in many of these dangerous industries. These are youth who are forced due to economic desperation to find work in these exploitative jobs because they don't have the authorization or ability to seek safer, more age-appropriate employment. And these are jobs in very dangerous conditions like meat packing, construction, agriculture. And agriculture is really an area that we're particularly concerned about because the standards are different than for employment in other sectors. Youth can be employed at much younger ages for longer hours. They don't have the same protections as young people in other industries. And so those are some of the loopholes that we are really trying to see reformed. And instead, we're seeing continued attempts to roll back these laws to allow youth work in more dangerous conditions for longer hours. And that will really disproportionately harm these youth of color, low-income families who are forced to do these jobs and don't really have an alternative.
So just remind us, Nina, why it is that farm workers, like domestic workers, are treated differently.
Sure. So under the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is sort of a landmark labor legislation of 1938, there were many types of workers who, for racist reasons, were excluded from protections under the FLSA, and agriculture is one of them. We still have not updated the Fair Labor Standards Act to align the standards of agriculture and other industries. And so there is this kind of two-tiered system that remains in which youth and all other workers who in agriculture, domestic work, and other industries are not afforded the same protections that they receive in other industries.
I can just feel my blood boiling as we talk about this, but coming to you, Steve, what are the justifications that people use as they argue to roll back these protections, or where they exist, the prohibitions?
Well, they're stunning in their hypocrisy. I know some defenders of this reform of child labor legislation say this is a good way of getting kids away from their TVs and their video games and stuff, and getting them doing sort of productive things. Another one is that it argues, another rationale argues, this will give parents control over what their kids are doing, when in fact some of these laws eliminate a stipulation that demands that kids of a certain age have to have parental permission to work in these places. So it's that kind of cant that is offered as a rationale for this legislation.
All right, we'll take a quick break. We'll come right back. You're watching City Works.
The CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies is the 25th and newest school under the CUNY umbrella. Dedicated to public service and social justice, the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies offers undergraduate and graduate degrees in the areas of labor studies and urban studies, and certificate programs in labor relations, public administration and public policy, healthcare policy and administration, and community leadership. We pride ourselves on being an institution that brings together activists and academics. Find out more at slu.cuny.edu.
Coming back with Steve Fraser and Nina Mast, we're talking about child labor, not in other parts of the world, but right here in the U.S. It's been spiking, and we're going to see some of it up close in a special report in just a bit. But before we do, Nina, I want to come back to you. Your report for the Economic Policy Institute is damning in the picture that it paints of a concerted effort to roll back protections and prohibitions on child labor. Who's behind that attack?
So, I mean, it's who you'd expect. It's the business industry lobbying groups in different states that really benefit from being able to cut labor costs and hire children to work in jobs that were previously done by adults. So these are groups like the National Restaurant Industry and their state affiliates. They are construction and building associations, travel and lodging associations, liquor and licensed beverage associations, grocery and retail associations. So all of these groups that tend to or seek to employ youth to do these low-wage jobs are really pushing hard behind these bills in the states. And then on top of that, and thanks to some great reporting from the Washington Post, we have seen the role of this right-wing think tank, the Foundation for Government Accountability, and its lobbying arm, the Opportunity Solutions Project, which is a Florida-based think tank that uses what people call, the IKEA model of legislation. They basically write model legislation related to child labor protection rollbacks for different states and shop them to the state legislature. So, and they've not only been involved in attempts to roll back child labor protections, specifically around the requirement for youth work permits, but at the same time, this group is also responsible for proposing legislation to cut unemployment insurance in many states, restricting access to Medicaid, imposing work requirements for SNAP, nutrition assistance. So this is really a concerted assault, not just on children as workers and as children, but on their families and on the social safety net that really supports families.
Where's the outrage as far as you can see? And where are the demands? What demands are you all making?
Yeah, and there's a lot of things that we can do at both the federal and state level. At the federal level, one thing is to pass the PRO Act. I mean, we need to be supporting unions and the people's right to form a union. We need to raise the minimum wage. The minimum wage is far too low. We know that, hasn't been raised since 2009. And these are really things that will benefit all workers, not just youth. We also need to end the two-tiered system that agriculture workers face in comparison to workers in other industries. And we really need to strengthen and increase funding for the Department of Labor and other agencies that are responsible for being able to enforce these laws. There simply isn't enough capacity to be able to handle the amount of child labor violations we're seeing, in addition to all the other wage and hour violations, occupational health and safety violations we're seeing. So increasing funding to the DOL is a big one.
What do you think about the situation of those kids and what can be done? If they're migrants here with the expectation that they will send support back to their families, like it or not, they do seek work.
Right, and we acknowledge that, some youth will have to work. And so it's about making sure that work is safe and age appropriate for those who are doing it. We also need to, fix our broken immigration system and be able to process asylum claims faster so that people can get the work authorization they need to work in more regulated employment situations. We also need more wraparound services and supports for migrant youth who are here sometimes alone. They have no family to look to, no supports, and they're really kind of just left to their own devices. And so we need to really support those youth, whether it's in terms of their education, social services, and to make sure that the work that they're doing is safe and age appropriate.
Anything you'd add to that list, Steve?
No, I think that's a great list. I think the only other thing to recognize is that this migrant problem originates in the United States, not abroad, because the United States' economic dominance of the global South has impoverished millions of people. NAFTA, for example, wiped out whole sectors of the Mexican economy. It produces this need to find employment here, and that's a bigger issue that can't be addressed by a single policy, but needs some transformation in the way we treat the rest of the world, the way the United States treats the rest of the world.
And we should say these companies that we're talking about in this country have a global footprint.
They do, and there are about 150 million child laborers around the world. They don't all work for American companies, obviously, but America has enormous clout and makes both the State Department and American economic interest make sure that these countries abroad are amenable to this kind of exploitation, that they don't regulate a lot of things, including child labor.
You take a historical approach to this, which I find very powerful and helpful. Why?
Well, I'm a historian, and I think whenever we face a present problem, we have to understand its origins and how we got into this situation. In this case, child labor was resisted for many years, finally successfully through the late 19th, early 20th century, the progressive movement, the New Deal, and we're now a society regressing. And the reasons for that are complicated. The decline of the labor movement is a key part of that. And the lessons to be drawn from that is if we're going to live in a humane society, we've got to once again empower working people, not only economically, but politically, to turn this around.
You talked, Nina, about the kind of intersecting issues of employment law, public education law, and the right of people in this society to have a safety net when they're in a crisis. Do you see coming out of that nexus a different looking labor movement? I mean, we have a labor movement that is in the streets these days, multiple strikes happening as we speak, and at the same time what Steve is describing in terms of decline. What needs to change?
Yeah, I think that the right has a very simple playbook. It's deregulate employment, it's privatize, it's erode the social safety net, shrink the public sector. And I think that, we need to be thinking big like that too. We need to be investing in public education, strengthening child labor laws, bolstering the social safety net, and really just creating an economy that works for working people. And I think, part of the labor movement plays a large role in that, but we need to bring in other folks as well. I think because this stems beyond labor, it's about the safety and health and well-being of everyone. And so I think what we're missing is this, this strong, comprehensive, and simple playbook that we can use to sort of enhance worker protections and create a safer working environment for all workers.
Get simpler, get stronger, and I would say restore our labor beat to our newspapers.
That would help.
Federal and local.
It used to be a commonplace that every major newspaper had a labor reporter. Now they don't exist, really.
Well, at least we have City Works. There's more ahead. Thank you both. Among the many children working in U.S. fields and factories are kids who've migrated here from other countries. Unaccompanied minors, teens under 18, most of them from Latin America, and many of them looking for work. In this special City Works report, we took a look at what these young people are going through.
In the last decade, workplace injuries for minors have doubled from around 160 to 325.
The growing use of child labor in the U.S. A 16-year-old from Guatemala died in an accident at a poultry plant in Mississippi last week.
Michael was in an accident on the job at Florence Hardwoods. He was trying to unjam a machine when the conveyor belt he was standing on moved, pinning him. He died at the hospital July 1st.
Police identified a 16-year-old killed while working at a Lee Summit recycling center in Waste Dump.
Investigators said the 16-year-old Hampton died after being pinned between a semi and its trailer.
Teenagers working in extremely dangerous workplaces, the kinds of workplaces that are the most dangerous for adults to work in, where there is very high risk of injuries.
This comes at a time when multiple states are actually rolling back their own child labor protection laws.
The sad reality is that teenagers are working at extremely dangerous jobs they're too young to handle. And on the nation's farms, children also work in harsh conditions. In fact, children as young as 12 are harvesting tobacco.
In the U.S. today, in 2023, it's legal to hire a child at the age of 12 to work unlimited hours on a tobacco farm of any size, a big commercial agribusiness operation, as long as they don't miss school and a parent has given them permission.
Human Rights Watch conducted extensive fieldwork in the tobacco fields of North Carolina. Their research included interviewing young migrant farm workers.
I had the opportunity to actually shadow a couple of kids that were working in the fields for the day. We woke up before the sun came up, boarded a school bus actually, and the kids file off the school bus and they're at a tobacco field. That's the work site for the day. So they cover themselves with black plastic trash bags. That's their defense against the nicotine and the pesticides and the toxins that are in this crop.
We wear trash bags, but throughout around 10 or 11, it starts getting really, really hot. So since the trash bags attract heat, you're just burning inside the trash bags, and you're just oh, I want to take them off.
When they spray, you can tell the chemical is very, 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 very strong. It hurts your nose. It burns. I got sick for 2 or 3 weeks. My head started hurting really bad. I had a big headache, and it's just. You feel nausea, your head starts hurting, you get fever, and it's just the chemicals really getting to you.
Acute nicotine poisoning is usually what we'll usually call green tobacco sickness. And it's basically whenever your body absorbs the tar, the nicotine, the chemicals, and to be honest, makes you sick.
Children, their bodies and brains are still developing, and so you have to think about what that nicotine exposure day in and day out could be doing to their developing brains and bodies. In burley tobacco, which is grown in Kentucky and Tennessee and other parts of the United States, there is still more manual labor involved. And so we interviewed children in those states who harvested tobacco by hand. They would take sharp axes, chop down a whole tobacco plant, a burley tobacco plant, and load it onto a spear that had a sharp spike on the end. And they would be paid based on how many of those spears they could load in a day's work. Some children then would help to load those spears of harvested tobacco into curing barns where they would hang to dry for many months. And then children we interviewed often didn't have adequate access to water, they didn't have restrooms or sanitation, there was not enough shade, they didn't get to take enough breaks, they were just really worked to the bone.
So I was 14 years old, my other sister was 13, and the youngest one was 12. I remember that first day.
Yesenia Cuello is the executive director of NC Field, an organization that supports farm workers in North Carolina. When she was 14, she began working alongside her mother in the tobacco fields.
I've worked with people that have found, this one is hard. Families and people living in cardboard boxes, or using cardboard boxes as their walls, people that don't have a home. They don't all have running water. My journey of being introduced into agricultural labor was actually initially through my mom. So she worked in hog farms in North Carolina, and then she worked in tobacco fields. It's really interesting sometimes the reaction that I get whenever I tell people that I'm a former child tobacco worker, and they're like, what sane parent would allow their child to go work in agriculture? What kind of system allows for that to continue to happen and be legal? So what are some of those maybe systemic issues that perpetuate what we see today and that allows it to not only continue to happen but thrive?
What was true across the board was that these were families that were living in poverty. They could not meet their basic needs, and that's why children were involved in this dangerous work.
I was 12 when I first started. I first started to work in the tobacco with my cousin. She told me if I wanted to go, and I was like, sure, because I needed to help my mom out with paying bills and stuff like that. So that's how I started going. And ever since, I've been going.
In 1938, when the Fair Labor Standards Act was adopted, it was part of a package of New Deal era legislation. Agricultural workers were intentionally excluded in order to deny Black people opportunities for economic advancement. At the time, agricultural work was predominantly performed by Black people. Today, agricultural work is predominantly performed by Latinx people, people of Hispanic or Latino descent, whether they're citizens or migrants. These exemptions that continue to exist in U.S. law are part of this racist legacy, and they continue to have racially disproportionate impacts. So it's people of color who are bearing the burdens, the harms of these laws and these loopholes. And so you can't talk about ending child labor in U.S. agriculture without talking about why this is an issue of racial equity and justice.
You know, we're often trying to tell people, like, make sure that, you know, farm workers and, you know, your immigrant population and your undocumented population are included and are part of conversations. Like, if you're talking about food, it should include farm workers. If you're talking about climate justice, it should include farm workers. If you're talking about social justice, racial justice, it should include farm workers. And I feel like that's been a large issue for why we are where we are today, and that's the fact that they have not been included and been part of the conversation.
Nor is Congress in the conversation. In June of this year, a bill to, quote, amend the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 to prohibit employment of children in tobacco-related agriculture by deeming such employment as oppressive child labor, failed to even reach the floor. The bill would outlaw anyone under the age of 18 from working in the fields. That means for now, there is no relief for the children of the tobacco fields.
If I had kids one day, like, I wouldn't let them work in the field, because since I work there, I know what it's like, and I wouldn't want them to go through the same thing I went through.
That's it for City Works. Thank you once again to our guests, Nina Mast from the Economic Policy Institute and historian Steve Fraser. If you have comments or questions, write to us at cityworks@slu.cuny.edu. For City Works, I'm Laura Flanders. Thanks for watching.